Hello, and welcome to Macabre Manuscripts. My name's Lorelei, and I'm your horror hostess. Since this is episode 1, I suppose we should start off by setting some expectations. The main purpose of this podcast or channel, depending on how you're watching, is for me to talk about the works and multiverse of Stephen King. This will eventually include Joe Hill's work as well, because he's written at least a couple of stories now that function within the world Stephen King created. While that is going to be my main point of discussion, I'm also going to take some time during episodes to discuss what else I'm currently reading. This should mostly stay within the realm of horror or thrillers, and I have a fairly extensive list of TikTok recommended horror books I've been slowly working my way through. I occasionally still read YA, but unless people are just really interested in my thoughts on that, I'll probably stay on task with the horror stuff. So, with that out of the way, let's start at the beginning. Carrie. There will be spoilers in case nobody's read a book that was published in 1974, but if you haven't, that's fine. It was published in 1974. And I don't know, maybe you don't like Carrie. Maybe you've seen the movie and you feel like I don't need to read the book. Anyway, so there will be spoilers, trigger warnings for miscarriage, rape, child abuse, religious fanaticism and abuse, murder, bullying, animal killing, blood, claustrophobia, and fire are all the ones I could think of. If I missed any, I'm very sorry. The description for Carrie on Goodreads is the story of misunderstood high school girl Carrie White. Her extraordinary telekinetic powers and her violent rampage of revenge remains one of the most barrier-breaking and shocking novels of all time. So, a rough summary. Carrie White, was born to a mother who seemed terrified of everything. As far as I could tell from the book, that was just how she'd always been. Margaret White lived with her parents until she was almost 30. Margaret's father was killed in a barroom gun battle about a year before she met Ralph White and moved away from home. After her father's death, Margaret also joined a fundamentalist church, which is where her religious fanaticism came into play. Shortly after Margaret and Ralph were married, Margaret had to be hospitalized, and it was speculated that she had induced a miscarriage because she and Ralph had conceived a baby out of wedlock. She made Ralph swear after that incident that they would never have sex again, because even once they were married, she seemed to consider sex a sin. Her mother later on did remarry, and Margaret would consistently lambaste her mother and new stepfather because their relationship to her was also a sin, even though Margaret's father had been dead for some time, I believe, when Margaret's mother decided to remarry. Margaret still considered that a sin. Based to Margaret White, basically everything was a sin. Ralph initially agreed to Margaret's demand that they never have sex again, but he went back on his word. First trying to seduce her, and then, after she'd thrown him out for the attempt, coming home drunk and raping her. This is how Carrie White was conceived. Ralph at some point dies in a construction accident, leaving Margaret and Carrie on their own. Carrie was a fairly normal child, which was not something her mother could abide. She was often punished for doing normal children things. I'd argue if Margaret was being honest, she was punishing her daughter for existing at all. When she was 3, there was an incident because Carrie got in trouble for talking to a girl who was sunbathing in the yard next door to them. So their neighbor's, like, I believe 17 at the time-year-old daughter, when Carrie was 3, was out in the backyard sunbathing. Carrie was talking to her through a fence, over a fence, something like that. And Margaret came out and just started yelling at her and then dragged her inside. And as Carrie's mother was punishing her inside the house, a rain of stones started crashing down onto their roof, which, at least in the moment, made Margaret stop, though it would not prevent future abuse. We also hear during one of the moments where we are in Margaret's side of the story, in her thoughts, feelings, all that, that she believes, first of all, that this is a curse, because of course it is, a curse from the devil, and that her grandmother, so it would have been Carrie's great-grandmother, also was cursed. but I don't believe Margaret's grandmother had ever done anything as extreme as so great great grandmother, because Margaret's grandmother, that's the, I think it's just one great. Anyway, details. It's fine. So yeah, Margaret had seen it before. She thought it was some kind of family curse. On top of all of that, Carrie had the bad luck of being born in a small town. Now, I've been around quite a few people who hear small town and think of places with populations of thousands. From the age of 9 or 10, I grew up in a small town with a population of 300. Not 300,000, just 300 people. The population of Chamberlain, Maine, when Carrie lives there in the book, is about 150 people. Unless you grew up in a town like this, I think it's very difficult to understand the social dynamics of a town that size. It's hard to process the idea that when somewhere in this book, if you haven't lived in a town like that, when it says the entire town did something, like the entire town legitimately was doing this thing. For Carrie, that means the entire town avoided her and her mother for the most part, uh, for basically Carrie's entire life, because Margaret was already acting like that even before Carrie was born. Once Carrie started going to school, children started bullying her. At least once in the novel, at least once in the novel, we're told something to the effect of, "That's just how everyone treated Carrie." Adults basically ignored her or were passingly polite to her. Other children bullied her mercilessly. Carrie, thanks to her mother, was incredibly behind the other children both socially and on matters of things that weren't necessarily taught in schools in the time period where this book is set. In 2023, the idea of a young woman having no idea what a period is seems outrageous, but in the 60s, with no friends to talk about it, no internet, no school classes on it, or just or a mother who we find out seems to believe you don't get your period unless you've had sex, or just looked at a man with lust. It was very possible for Carrie to have no idea what was happening when she got her first period. Carrie got her period for the first time in her senior year of high school, in the showers after gym. She legitimately thought she was dying at the time. Instead of helping her, because why would they do that, the other girls who had been in her gym class started harassing Carrie, yelling at her to plug it up and pelting her with sanitary products. Her gym teacher initially grew angry at how Carrie was reacting until she realized the full situation and why Carrie was so scared. From what we hear in the story, Rita Desjardins was the first one to show Carrie more than a passing kindness. Like, base, basically ever. Some of her teachers were nice about her or polite to her, but I don't think any of them took the time. And after this incident, we see a few times where Rita, the gym coach, tries to take the time for Carrie and support Carrie. Most of Carrie is written from the perspective of books, interviews, news articles, and other literary sources documenting what happened the night of Carrie's senior prom. Having this outside perspective on things shows us that it wasn't just that Carrie thought no one cared about her. We see it as objective fact. The town let her be abused not just by her mother, but also by the people she went to school with. Carrie's life was one of seclusion and torture for no better reason than her mother. Children learn from and mirror their parents. Some grow out of that and form their own opinions as they get older, some don't. Being in a town of 150 people meant everyone knew Margaret White, everyone gossiped about Margaret White in front of their children, and when she would have started going to school, everyone would immediately know who Carrie's mother was and immediately dislike her because their parents disliked her mother. Carrie never had a chance at any kind of normalcy with the situation she was given. To make up for her part in Carrie being bullied in the showers, one girl, Sue Snell, got her boyfriend Tommy to ask Carrie to prom. Now, why she couldn't just say, "I'm sorry," and try to be Carrie's friend instead of, you know, this whole number, I wish I could say I didn't know, but I do. You see, if Sue had just tried to be Carrie's friend after this and start hanging out with her and spending time with her, then Sue would have started getting bullied. Sue would have started Sue would have started suffering the social negatives of defending and being friends with Carrie White. And she didn't want to do that. Her boyfriend Tommy, for whatever reason, I guess she felt was safe from suffering these consequences. I guess because he had the shield of, well, Sue told me to. I'm doing it for Sue, not because I like Carrie. Even though Tommy does genuinely seem to get to the point where he likes Carrie and gets to know Carrie. Mm-hmm. Also, after the shower incident, we do see that Sue does start to take the time, at least part of the time, to defend Carrie when mostly another girl, Christine Hargensen, tries to go out of her way to continue to bully Carrie or spread things about Carrie. Sue and a few of the other girls who were part of the incident in the showers have now at least started telling Christine to knock it off and that it's not cute or funny. So, progress. Christine Chris Hargensen was a privileged brat who, because her father was an attorney who kowtowed to her, wasn't used to hearing the word no. After her father failed uh, in an attempt to get the principal of the school to remove Christine's punishment for the shower incident by threatening to sue the school and failed, Chris began to come up with her own ideas for revenge. Christine convinces her boyfriend, Billy Nolan, to do the dirtier part of the work for her. He takes friends and goes to a nearby farm. They kill and drain the blood from a couple of pigs. The night before prom, she and Billy sneak into the venue where prom will be held and place the buckets, with the blood currently frozen inside of them, above the place where the prom king and queen will be sitting once results are announced. While all this has been happening, we see snippets of Carrie realizing that she has and can control telekinetic powers. She's been practicing her powers discreetly and out of sight of her mother so that her mother won't accuse her of sin. Most of her practice is not harmful. Most of her practice is not harmful, but there is a time where she makes a small boy fall off of his bike because he's being rude to her, which shows Carrie is capable of cruelty, though at this point in the story, we have every indication that that is not how Carrie intends to move forward using her powers, and that was more a moment of weakness feels like the wrong word, but some it was more of a slip. It isn't in Carrie's nature to be cruel that we see at this point. It's not in Carrie's nature to harm others purposely. Jumping back into the narrative, on the night of prom, we see Carrie and her mother argue. Margaret wants Carrie to burn the dress, which Carrie bought the materials for and made all by herself, and stay home. She wants her to repent. Carrie refuses, and Margaret switches to trying to convince her that this is all just a setup so the other teenagers at prom can laugh at Carrie. When Margaret will not let up, Carrie uses her telekinesis to shove Margaret out of her room so that Carrie can finish getting ready. Shortly after, Tommy comes and picks Carrie up. Margaret, now alone in the house with only her fears and thoughts and paranoia around Sin and her daughter, decides enough is enough, and when Carrie gets home, she plans to eliminate the Sin for good. When Carrie and Tommy arrive at the prom, the other teens are genuinely stunned to see the change in Carrie. For the first time in a long time, Carrie is genuinely happy and is being accepted by most of the people at the dance. Unbeknownst to most of those in attendance, Chris and Billy are also there, back behind the scenes preparing to set off their trap. Carrie and Tommy win prom king and queen, and when they're sure Tommy and Carrie are standing where they need to, Chris and Billy set off their trap and let the buckets drop. Both Carrie and Tommy are soaked, but one of the buckets also breaks from its string and strikes Tommy in the head, knocking him down and disorienting him. For me personally, I kind of can't help but wonder if Tommy hadn't been knocked out, if maybe what happened next could have been avoided. I guess we'll never know, but it's an interesting thing to consider because he couldn't, while Carrie is kind of spiraling in this moment, Tommy can't defend himself. So there is a dead silence for several seconds while the crowd of prom goers processes what has just happened. Then they start laughing. From the outside perspective that we, the reader, get, we can see that most of this laughter is confused or surprised, because most of the people here did not know that was going to happen. But Carrie, all Carrie knows is that this is the laughing Mama warned her about. Carrie, with no one to convince her otherwise, immediately comes to the conclusion that this was the plan the entire time, and that all of the students who would be attending prom knew that this was going to happen. Broken-hearted and furious, Carrie experienced what I would call and roughly consider a psychotic break, and lets her rage manifest through her telekinetic abilities. She locks down the building and starts wreaking havoc that culminates in the building being on fire. When she realizes that fire alarms are going to quickly bring help, she lets herself out of the gym and blows the fire hydrants nearest the school so that the fire trucks won't have anything to hook up to when they arrive, preventing them from putting out the fire. Too lost in her pain to gain control again, Carrie systematically destroys the town that never protected her as she makes her way home to her mother. Once she arrives, she uses her powers to destroy most of the items in the house. Her mother, who's been waiting with a hidden butcher knife, manages to get Carrie to listen to her. Carrie hears about her father, about her mother's miscarriage, about how her mother tried to kill Carrie twice when she was younger because she considered Carrie a punishment. Carrie actually stops for a moment, feeling this new information, taking in this new information. She stops, and her mother convinces Carrie to get down on her knees and pray. As Carrie bows her head to pray, Margaret stabs Carrie in the back, driving the knife to the hilt into Carrie's shoulder. Carrie, in return, uses her powers to slowly stop her mother's heart. With the mother's story now in Carrie's mind, our main character leaves her home for the last time and goes to the roadhouse where her father got drunk all those years ago, which led him to come home and rape Margaret. Chris and Billy had run to the roadhouse where Billy had rented a room and were hiding out there. After getting a heads up from Billy's friend that Carrie was on a rampage and destroying the town, Billy and Chris get into his car and begin driving away. They come across Carrie walking in the road. Billy speeds up, planning on running Carrie over and killing her. Carrie takes control of Billy's car and flings it into the roadhouse. Carrie, who has been broadcasting her thoughts and feelings to the town because her powers are completely out of control, is found by Susan Snell and dies from blood loss because her mother had cut an artery when she stabbed Carrie. And that's where the story ends. Carrie is dead, but Carrie has been dead the whole book, because we are seeing this in mostly snippets from, there was a entire investigation, like a government investigation, because of the powers that Carrie showed that she had and how strong they could get. Susan Snell wrote a book. There were articles written on the situation. There were other books on telekinesis that primarily focused on Carrie and the incident in Chamberlain, Maine. So a lot of it is outside perspective, but we also see some of it confirmed in the narrative as we're going along, because like a book or article will say something and then we'll come back into the story from someone's point of view, and what the story or article or whatever said will be confirmed or denied. The novel Carrie was initially released in 1974. Stephen King has said he originally threw the beginning of the manuscript into the trash, but his wife Tabitha pulled it out, read it, and told him he needed to finish it. Carrie became King's first published novel. I've heard it said that Stephen King does not write women well. I may make an entire episode about all of the reasons I disagree with it, but for right now, let's stick with Carrie. Carrie, I feel like, having grown up in kind of the same environment that's described in the book is a very realistic idea of what it's like to be a teenage girl, especially a teenage girl in this small town, and just being an outsider. For I was an outsider because I moved to the town when I was 9 or 10, and all of these other kids I was going to school with had basically been going to school together or been around each other since they were born in some way or the other. Carrie only ever wanted to be accepted, but because of her mother's reputation, she was doomed from the start. That may not seem realistic if you never lived in a small town, but when everyone literally knows everybody, it's not only possible but quite simple. Add to that the older generation's mentality of kids will be kids, um, and you set yourself up for a microcosm where Carrie can be entirely isolated from care and support, including from her mother, because her mother had whatever Margaret had going on, possibly schizophrenia. I'm not sure. I feel like there had to have been something with Margaret way before Carrie for the place that Margaret ended up. Even the good kids would stand by and do nothing while Carrie was bullied. They say it a couple of times, if not more. Just, well, yeah, but that's how everybody treated Carrie. That's just Carrie. That's how we always treat Carrie. And as somebody who was just a teenager in general, unfortunately, yeah, if everybody's doing it, there is very much a it must be okay mentality, especially in smaller groups or smaller locations like you see Carrie living in. And it's not like Carrie was a problem, if that makes sense. She wasn't proselytizing to people. She wasn't walking around like her mother screaming at everybody about how they were sinning or they were evil or they were monsters or what the hell ever Margaret was saying to people. There's a few examples of people who were interviewed who were like, well, Margaret did this or Margaret did that. And you can understand why people didn't like Margaret. But Carrie didn't do that. At the point where we come into the story, Carrie just wants to be left alone. She's not bothering anybody. She's not harassing anybody. She's not outwardly doing anything that should be making her a target. I went to a school where my freshman year, there was a senior who would walk around with a Nazi armband on. Now, there's probably a reason that guy didn't have friends. I did not try to be his friend. He was a senior, and he was wearing a Nazi armband. There's probably a reason he didn't have friends. Carrie doesn't do that. She just doesn't have nice clothes because she makes most of her own clothes. Well, she has nice clothes. The descriptions we get in a book a lot of the time, in the book, she makes things very nice. Her prom dress, a lot of people compliment her prom dress and are surprised when she says, oh, I made it myself, because of how good she did, because she's always made her own clothes. So there's just this kind of missing piece of just because. People bullied Carrie just because. People were rude to Carrie just because it was fun, because they liked seeing her reactions, because they wanted to, because when you don't teach kids better, it seems like a lot of them end up in this place where they just need somebody to be less than them. Or maybe that's the learned thing. Maybe maybe all of these people's parents were bad influences, and that's why we end up in a place where all of these people needed Carrie to be less than them, even though she wasn't doing anything wrong for most of what we can see. And on top of that, she's not anyone that the school or the teachers feel like they need to defend. Because up until Chris Hargenson's dad um, walks into the principal's office threatening to sue him to try to get Christine unbanned from prom, none of the adults have ever done anything to stop the way Carrie's being treated. And even the principal kind of weaponizes her, because the way he stops Chris's dad is, well, listen, we as the school can be considered a guardian ad litem to Carrie White. So if you try to sue us for what we're doing to your daughter by banning her from prom, we are going to go after your daughter for what she did to Carrie, because it was assault. And it's not wrong. I just wish a lot better for this person that I know is fictional. And I know there's a reason that the story was written the way it was, so don't like. I know all of this happened narratively in this story for a reason. But I had a lot of the same general bullying experience, and I didn't get cool telekinetic powers out of it. So I can empathize with Carrie. Minus the cool telekinetic powers. At one point, we get a snippet from a book Susan Snell wrote later on in her life. She says, "We were kids. We were kids. We were kids trying to do our best." And I think Susan Snell is lying not just to everybody else, but probably also to herself. Because those kids knew what they were doing. They knew the things they did hurt Carrie. The ones that didn't stand up for Carrie knew they didn't want to be in the line of fire for that treatment. And it just feels like this cycle, right? Like, well, we didn't know better. Yes, you did, because you know you wouldn't have wanted that done to you. You just didn't have the empathy for whatever reason to either not do it to Carrie or to stop it from happening to Carrie. But these were at this point in the story. Earlier on, they were young kids. Young kids do dumb stuff. But by the time we are included in the story, in the main part of Carrie's life that we are given, these kids are 16 to, I think, Billy Nolan might be 19 years old. And at this point, it's just because it's fun. They're just doing it because it's fun. And I hope that, as the author, Stephen King meant for that statement to sound as hollow and kind of self-pitying as it does. Because, yeah, you were kids, but you wouldn't have wanted it happening to you. You wouldn't have wanted that treatment done to you. But you kept letting it happen to her. I suppose I don't necessarily mean the entire town deserved to be incinerated because of how Carrie was mistreated, but I wish the story could be taken more as a cautionary tale than as a horror story. It is. It's a horror story, but I feel like the same as a lot of stories in our lives, there is something that can be learned from it. people can only be pushed too far. Some people's tolerance is higher than others. If all any of the other students had done was leave Carrie alone, I doubt anything would have ever happened. She may at some point have still ended up killing her mother, and I don't think I could blame her. From her mother locking her in a closet until she would have accidents on herself, or just for hours on end where she would be screaming and crying, or beating her, screaming at her. Her mother wouldn't let her out. Isolation isn't fantastic, but I think most people who were bullied or harassed in school would argue they'd have preferred to just be left to their own devices than to be harassed for no better reason than the other kids were bored and you're an easy target. I'll end up saying this a lot, especially for King's books, but the horror of Carrie to me is not that she's got powers and went on a rampage. The horror was the people around her. The horror is that this was an entirely preventable situation. If people had been just a shade nicer to Carrie, if her mother had been just a shade less abusive, just slightly less abusive, maybe, because maybe we can't get to 0, but we could do a shade less abusive. If someone had done something about how Carrie was treated at home or at school, if one of the few people who knew what Chris Hargensen was planning had told the school about the blood, so that last cruelty was cut off before it could happen. I doubt that's a super revolutionary thought about the novel, that it's more tragedy than horror. Fear of something as small as retaliation by the bad prevented the good from doing anything. Sue and other students who didn't actively bully Carrie also never stopped it for years. Bullies are only successful through isolation. The Chris Hargensens of the world will give up if people aren't amused by their antics, if they aren't getting the attention they want from their behavior, or if they are getting serious negative consequences for their behavior. And I don't mean like detentions or ISS or that kind of thing, because a lot of kids like that I knew didn't want to be in class anyway, right? They didn't want to be there. They didn't want to be in school. That's part of why they were doing what they were doing. They were amusing themselves because they didn't want to actually be there learning or doing what they were supposed to be doing. It has to be negative social consequences from your peer groups that stops this kind of behavior. Because if everybody had started not even bullying Chris, if people had just started shunning Christine or any other people who were just like being mean to Carrie for the laughs or for the fun of it, she would have stopped. Those kids would have stopped because they don't want that. Not in the long term. They can put up with it for the short term, but if they're only ever getting that like if they're the isolated ones, if they're the ones who end up being ignored and their behavior by the other students, not by teachers, should still do something. There should still be like discipline from that side of it. But other students also needed to be like, hey, we're not going to be cool with you if you keep doing this. We are not going to kowtow to you, and we are not going to do this with you because Carrie's not bothering anybody. Carrie's not doing anything. But that's life, I guess. I don't think it should have to be. And I think I see it getting better. I just hope maybe more people realize at some point, hey, maybe if we stop encouraging these people, they'll stop doing this, they'll stop hurting other people because it's fun and it gets them attention and acknowledgement. And unfortunately, a lot of laughs sometimes. Anyway, on to some speculations I have about Carrie. If I had to guess, I'd say at the time Stephen King wrote Carrie, he didn't have a lot of the Dark Tower universe anywhere in his mind or put together. He had apparently started working on it in some form in 1970, which was 4 years before Carrie was published. Since Carrie was his first published novel, we wouldn't have any context for reference to other stories or histories that would come later. I don't know that he intended it, but I noticed something that, with my knowledge of his future work and of the Tower, made me wonder something. Carrie's father, Ralph White, is described to have eyes so intense they seem to glow. Also, during one of the times Carrie is thinking about her mother, we're told that in a dream, Carrie had once dreamed Margaret fought the Black Man and won. I think the Black Man is one of the ways the devil was historically referred to, so we can assume that Margaret, and possibly King at the time, also meant Margaret White in Carrie's dream had battled the devil and won. But the farther we'll get into King, into his work, the less I believe in coincidence. So imagine my lack of surprise while listening to The Stand when I hear one of the names Randall Flagg goes by is the Black Man. She may have beaten him in the dream, but if my speculation is correct, it doesn't seem Margaret was able to beat Flagg in the real world, which is why I brought up Ralph White's eyes. I believe, Eyes of the Dragon, we learn that Martin, the Man in Black, Randall Flagg, on, has lived many lives and taken many forms. We know from having the entire story later, one of those forms was Randall Flagg. Flagg is an agent of chaos. He has no true side. He has no affiliation. We see in The Stand that he has paraphernalia, buttons, pamphlets, etc. for every type of organization from the KKK to the Black Panthers. He comes when things are changing. Flagg at one point says he comes when change begins. The way Ralph's eyes are described makes me wonder if he was entirely human. Flagg mentions in The Stand that he, in the form of Randall Flagg, did not initially have magical abilities or powers, that he began to develop them at some point when things started to change. Ralph, as far as we know, never showed any magical prowess. However, from the histories described in documents in Carrie, we can speculate, or it might have outright been said, that he was a recessive carrier of the gene for telekinesis. And we know that Margaret's grandmother was, because we saw in Margaret's memories or thoughts or whatever that she remembered her grandmother doing small things with her mind. So Margaret is also a recessive carrier, because Margaret never showed any abilities herself. If it was Flagg, I doubt even Ralph himself knew what he was. I believe the Man in Black at some point during the Tower series mentions that not all his lives were flashy or openly villainous as he is in his true form, the one Roland is chasing, or even as Flagg. We learn from the government investigation reports on Carrie and the Black Prom incident that she was the first major case of telekinesis in the United States that the government is aware of. They state overconfidently and stupidly in their report that they do not expect something like what happened in Chamberlain, Maine to happen again. Carrie is a beginning of that world acknowledging the existence and possibly severe danger of people, women specifically, as it's stated in the narrative that the power only manifests in women and men will always be recessive carriers who have telekinetic abilities. She is also, as I've mentioned, the beginning of King's amazing career that currently spans 65 novels and over 200 short stories. And knowing that King had already been crafting The Dark Tower before he started writing Carrie, Wouldn't it make sense if he, intentionally or perhaps subconsciously, knitted his most repeating antagonist into the narrative, albeit as a minor influence in this instance? That's all I currently think I have to say about Carrie. In the future, I intend to have an episode with some guests to further discuss and dissect the actions of Carrie and the other students at our school. I also plan to make an episode revolving around the way King writes a lot of mother-daughter relationships, though Carrie is one of the more overtly abusive. I'll be discussing many others alongside her that are also abusive, but not in the blatant and very physical way that Margaret White is abusive. I just want to get a fuller scope of the matter since I'm currently trying to get through the extended version of The Stand, and I'm sure what I want to talk about bridges many more of his works. I plan to wrap up my episode by giving you a quick rundown of some non-King books I'm currently reading or have recently finished. I've been on TikTok for quite a while and on Book Talk specifically for a year or so. I started a spreadsheet of horror, thriller, disturbing stories that were recommended on there and started hunting them down to read for myself. For this episode, since it feels pretty similar, I think I'll tell you guys about Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. Weirdly, this is primarily listed as a romance novel when you Google it, and most of the reviews seem to agree that it's quirky and hilarious. Those descriptions are one of the many reasons why I have trust issues. I was deeply confused on how this book had ended up getting recommended to me on what I thought was my very carefully curated TikTok account until I started reading it. Yes, the protagonist has quirks, but they're reflective of deep and lasting trauma she has experienced throughout her life. I'm not sure if she's meant to be autistic, but if that was the goal, then I find it even more cruel to call her behaviors quirky. Maybe I would have enjoyed the book more if I hadn't spent the majority of it trying to figure out what the reviewers who handled the book were talking about. I also could have enjoyed the book more if they hadn't included the trope, woman changes because man forces himself into her life. Did Eleanor need help? Yes. Could she have ended up coming to that conclusion in 100 different ways that didn't involve a man? Also yes. And before anyone comes for me, I'm going into the books that end up on my TikTok FYP as blind as possible. Some had minor descriptions of what to expect, but some are just disturbing books, or some other caption at the top of the video and someone flashing different covers. This wasn't a bad book, but I think it may be one that, if I tried to have a conversation with someone who wrote one of the quirky reviews about it, I would get told it's not that deep. And I don't like those kinds of books. I'm not good at surface level reading as an adult. The trigger warnings on this, I'd advise, are on child abuse, child murder, attempted child murder, arson, rape, domestic abuse, alcoholism, stalking, and bullying. I'm not saying don't read it. I'm saying go into it expecting. Maybe the better thing is not expecting. If you go in expecting something very disturbing, in a way you'll get what you're looking for. I don't walk out of that book with the feeling of romance, which is why it's weird that it's primarily listed on Goodreads as romance and then psychological fiction, or whatever the second tag is. But I think that does it for the first episode of Macabre Manuscripts. If you made it to the end, I hope you enjoyed it. You can subscribe to my channel if you want to hear more of my opinion on Stephen King and sundry other books I get my hands on. I hope you all have a good evening, and I'm gonna go rest my voice because I don't usually talk this much.